Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences Grand Round Series. My name is Joe Caramelli. I oversee Grand Rounds for our department. I do want to say just a couple of things about our Grand Round Series before I introduce today's presentation and today's speakers. First, there is a group of us that works on Grand Rounds each week, including Mike, Semhar, and Charles. There's a couple of different sources of funding that I want to acknowledge for the Grand Round series, including the Ripley Fund, the Garvey Institute for Brain Health Solutions, and today the Muriel King Taylor Fund. I invite you to write in any questions or comments into the chat or the Q&A. Either one works fine. I'll keep track of those questions and can go through those with the presenters at the end. So with that, I'll just move on to saying a little bit about today's presentation and introduce today's two speakers. Now, today we have a joint presentation by Dr. Rachel Talley and Dr. Marianne Albaugh, who worked together on a statewide effort in Pennsylvania called the Pennsylvania Psychiatric Leadership Council Racial Justice Learning Collaborative, or the PPLC. Now, together they have several aims, including one, to improve the recruitment and retention of minoritized racial and ethnic individuals, and two, developing anti-racist curriculum in a wide range of psychiatric training settings in Pennsylvania. I'll say just a couple of brief things about each presenter, and then we'll move on to the presentation. First, Dr. Rachel Talley is an assistant professor of clinical psychiatry in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Talley also directs the department's fellowship in community psychiatry and is Associate Program Director for the department's Psychiatry Residency Program. She's had several leadership positions, including what I had just mentioned about this collaborative, and is a member of the board of the American Association for Community Psychiatry and the National Council for Mental Wellbeing Medical Director Institute. Dr. Marianne Albaugh is a psychiatrist with subspecialty training in child and adolescent psychiatry, and works with Deerfield Behavioral Health as a medical director in Erie County, and is a fellowship director of the UPMC Rural Community Psychiatry Fellowship. Dr. Albaugh has had several leadership positions as well, including with the Pennsylvania Psychiatric Society as a past president and as an Area 3 representative to the APA Assembly for the American Psychiatric Association. Now, with that, I think I'll stop there for now and turn it over to today's presenters.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and we are delighted to be here today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and start my slide presentation here. So I'm Rachel Talley. I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Marianne Albaugh, and as Dr. Caramelli introduced, we're so excited here to present on this effort that we are involved with through our membership in the Pennsylvania Psychiatric Leadership Council. And what we are involved with is a racial justice learning collaborative. We hope that some of the take-home messages in this presentation will be around building a sustained and action-oriented intervention to address issues of inequity and thinking about the workforce and mental health. First, in terms of disclosures, we have none in particular to disclose. I'll comment that I do have an uncompensated role as a medical advisor to an early stage startup, but that it is uncompensated and unrelated to the work here. And that also we acknowledge our colleagues in the Pennsylvania Psychiatric Leadership Council. Much of the work we're going to be talking about today is truly a team sport and a group effort. I think I speak for Marianne in saying that we are just excited to be here to represent this group effort that we have going on in Pennsylvania.
Absolutely.
And then I'll sharing a little bit of a roadmap of where we hope to head today. We summarize it as sort of the why, the what, and the what next. And so we're going to start with sharing a little bit of data talking about the issues of underrepresentation in terms of the psychiatric workforce, which is some of the issues that are what our learning collaborative and our racial justice initiative are looking to address. As well as some where these things can be relevant in terms of thinking about disparate mental health outcomes for minoritized communities. We'll tell you a little bit about the history of the Pennsylvania Psychiatric Leadership Council itself, as well as some of the sort of the background and the history of this racial justice initiative and what the components of that initiative are. And then we'll talk a little bit about how we have thought about sort of outcomes and lessons learned for this initiative, and including some of, I'd say, some of the complexity and challenges in thinking about concrete outcomes, as well as what we see as the way forward in this work. I'll comment also that I know that the chat is open for questions, that we welcome questions and comments. We'll probably mostly try to dive into questions at the end of the presentation, but please feel free to put questions in the chat as we move forward. So first, speaking a little bit to this issue of representation in the psychiatric workforce. So here I have a chart with some data from a recent article in Academic Psychiatry that I think sort of highlights in a nutshell that we have certain minority groups who have been historically underrepresented, I'd say in the mental health workforce across the board. But here we're focusing specifically on the workforce of psychiatrists, and that these disparities, unfortunately, have been persistent across decades and are persistent across levels of training. So this data, in which this group of researchers looked at basically representation in the U.S. Census, so just looked at sort of national representation in terms of underrepresented minoritized communities, and then looked at those identities and how they're represented in applicants to psychiatry residency, those who actually successfully enter psychiatry residency, psychiatric fellows, medical school graduates, and then also practicing psychiatrists and physicians. We see that there is disparity across the board. Of note, I'd say this is sort of one of the sort of take homes I found of this article was that we are seeing change, just perhaps not as quickly as we might like, that there are signs of improvement, and that we do see over time. This article both looked at a snapshot in 2016, but then also looked at trends over the past over 30 years from 1987 to 2016, that we do see the numbers of folks of underrepresented minority background very slowly rising over time in our psychiatric trainee workforce. But I think particularly I would direct you to look at sort of the numbers at the bottom of the slide. I think we see that we still have a lot of ground to cover and essentially make up for in terms of building that diverse workforce amongst our practicing psychiatric physicians and amongst our psychiatric faculty, the folks who are sort of responsible for doing that training and education in our academic centers. This is some additional data from that article, specifically looking at those trends that I was talking about. Again, that first snapshot was from 2016. This is going back 30 years and looking forward. And so we see, if we look at that line, that sort of underrepresented minority identity in general, we see a gradual creep up from 6.5% to 8.6% over these 30 years, but we see that we're not doing much above sort of flat, if you will. And so I think speaks to the fact that there are a lot of challenges that really persist in terms of bringing in folks who have not traditionally been in this workforce and making this workforce more representative of who needs and receives mental health services, and just more representative of our general population. Now, thinking about representation and why does this matter? Why should this matter? You know, I think there are some who would say simply that it is simply important morally for people of all backgrounds to have access to all professions, and that for that reason alone, this is an important issue. But I think this is particularly important when we think about disparity issues when it comes to mental health services and people of racial and ethnic minoritized identity, and how we might think about the power of a diverse workforce to address some of those disparities potentially. So first, in terms of just those disparities themselves, and of course, disparity by race, ethnicity, and mental health, very large, broad topic, but just giving a couple of snapshots here, pieces that I want to particularly emphasize is that while there certainly is data that in terms of mental health conditions, we don't necessarily see tremendous disparities across the lifespan in terms of just sort of prevalence of diagnosis between those of the majority identity, racial identity, versus those of the racial and ethnic minoritized identity. But we certainly can see differences in terms of the chronicity and severity in the course of those illnesses. And that one factor that we might consider is sort of access to and engagement in treatment. there are several studies looking at nationally representative data that have shown disparities between those of the racial and ethnic minoritized identity versus the majority identity in terms of access to mental health services, whether that is access period in terms of just sort of data showing any mental health visit, access to psychotropic medications, access to minimally adequate services. Troublingly, there is some national data that demonstrates these disparities worsening over time in terms of access to any form of mental health care. And so it's an important factor for us to consider. While we know that there are a range of sort of complex and nuanced factors in terms of a person's life and environment and relationships that can contribute to the course and severity of a mental health condition, the fact that folks of marginalized identity are not accessing these resources in the same way is certainly something deserving of our attention in terms of thinking about how we ensure that our care is equitable and accessible to all. I'll pause just to see, Marianne, I don't know if there are any comments you wanted to add as far as the child and adolescent perspective on this.
Yes, just wanted to tap in, and the data that comes out of the Surgeon General just shows a serious concern of an uptick in Black children in particular for increasing risks and rates of suicidal ideation and suicidal behavior. And it speaks to, I just hot off the press in our local paper, a conversation around school-based treatments and the ability to access care, and accessing care in a way that feels trustworthy and accessible with someone that perhaps looks like me. And that is so underrepresented for African-American children. And so I think that this is part of our concern. How do we gather this over the course of time? And I'll hand it back to you, Rachel.
Right, absolutely. Relevant across the lifespan. And dovetailing off of what you just raised, Marianne, and sort of thinking about this connection, sort of what is this connection of, well, we're looking at the workforce and the diversity of the workforce. We're thinking about disparities in services. How do we think of those two as connected? In what ways might we think about having a more diverse workforce being important to increasing access to mental health services? And I think an important connection to consider as far as the research literature is that which is available in terms of this issue of identity match, specifically racial identity match between patient and clinician, and where that can impact mental health outcome. And so this is a little bit old data, this 2011 meta-analysis that dives into this issue. And the literature has shown pretty consistently that for folks of racial and ethnic minoritized identity, there is a strong self-reported preference for working with a clinician of a matched racial identity, and also a positive perception of providers who have a shared racial ethnic identity. I do want to, in a sense, caveat that does this mean that people of identity, all identities can't serve all people? Of course not. But I think it's really important when we think about people delaying access, delaying seeking treatment or not seeking treatment, period, not taking that first step in terms of access. We have to really think about what are the sort of things that are going to bring a person through the front door in the first place. And so that's where I think this literature is powerful for us to consider as far as the preferences that folks are sharing and the perceptions that people may have about a provider right off the bat that may draw them into care, potentially will make them more likely to sustain care. Of note, in terms of some of the mixed findings in this literature, and again, this is a meta-analysis that looked across racial and ethnic backgrounds, looked back several decades, basically looked at effect size, basically looked at sort of overall effect size in terms of treatment outcome. For this particular meta-analysis, looking on the whole of the literature, there was not a significant difference in terms of treatment outcomes. So this is things like duration of tenure in treatment, global assessment of function, things along those lines. However, that was sort of the overall effect size. When you broke, the study noted that there was significant heterogeneity. And when you broke things down by different racial ethnic backgrounds, you do see some differences in terms of different patient populations, and where this might be relevant. And I want to highlight that specifically for the Black and African American population, which has been the initial area of focus for our racial justice collaborative. We see much larger effect sizes than the average in terms of both preference for a clinician of matched race and positive perception of a clinician of matched race. And although it's a small effect size, in the Black and African American population, we do see a significantly better treatment outcome effect size when there is a match in terms of race, in terms of racial identity. And so again, important things to consider in terms of how do we bring in this group that has been traditionally marginalized and underserved and ensure that they're coming into the door. The workforce is something to consider. So moving forward, I'm going to turn it over to Mary Ann to start to talk a little bit about the Pennsylvania Psychiatric Leadership Council and our history and our initiative.
Absolutely. So the Pennsylvania Psychiatric Leadership Council, fondly known as the PPLC, had its roots and founding in the early 2000s. There was a number of like-minded folks that really came from a variety of areas of life experience. Psychiatrists across the state, as well as administrative leadership from community mental health centers and administrators of County Department of Human Services, family members, as well as those with lived experience. So we brought together really a wonderful group of voices in looking at how we could improve community mental health for our state in particular, but looking at a lack of community focus in academic settings. So who was teaching what? I had the great privilege of, in my training, coming from Hahnemann, where community mental health, that was what we did. And we went to our community mental health centers, a lot of work around that focus. And I think that in our current modern academic training centers, what we were seeing, at least in our area, was this lack of focus on community mental health, a lot of emphasis on hospital. So we saw this need, and we were able to partner with our state folks for funding. And that has been really at the leadership of Estelle Richmond. So Estelle Richmond was in her position as Deputy Secretary Department of Human Services at the time, and was able to help support this process. And as part of that, came the outgrowth of our community psychiatry fellowships. So there's this linkage in the PPLC with community fellowships, community psychiatry fellowships, and the work that the PPLC does. So really it was a group of like-minded folks that came together to push forward some initiatives. We started to meet perhaps twice a year, sometimes 3 times a year. That all changed with COVID and allowed us to really gear up. And I'm gonna pass things over.
Absolutely. And so dovetailing all of that off of that, and I've been privileged to be part of the PPLC as the lead for our community psychiatry initiatives at University of Pennsylvania. I think a key pivot point in the past couple of years, of course, I would say nationally, but for the PPLC, like many organizations, was in the summer of 2022, the summer of 2020. When we experienced, of course, several highly publicized incidents of unarmed Black Americans dying at the hands of the police. Here on the slide, I have the pictures, of course, of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, as well as Walter Wallace Jr. Walter Wallace was an example of somebody who was particularly resonant for us in Pennsylvania, because this was a gentleman in Philadelphia with a history of a mental health condition, family requested help from 911 to address a mental health crisis, and he ended up unfortunately losing his life at the hands of the police. And so I think, like a lot of organizations, the PPLC was left in a space of basically started to have more frequent and intensive conversations around this issue, but sort of searching for and thinking for, well, what do we do beyond conversation? What is our next step as far as doing something substantial beyond talking and addressing this issue? And where does this issue of racial inequity align with the PPLC's core mission of thinking about psychiatric workforce and thinking about building the public and community mental health workforce? And so what we found, I think, it was a good sort of very clear area of alignment of, well, perhaps important work for the PPLC would be to think about how do we ensure we are building a diverse workforce that considers in which we see representation of folks who have traditionally been underserved by our mental health system. And so from there, we basically wanted to take our next step as far as thinking about how to formulate something like this and where we might get the right content or information in terms of a direction in which we could go to support this workforce.
And so we, as the slide indicates, we are launching to this roundtable in the spring of 2021. However, I want to back up for a moment and just think about moving from the summer of 2020 to that early spring of 2021. There was a lot of work and a lot of energy. Our group started with COVID, actually. So our leadership started to pull us together virtually, and we were meeting every week, Thursday night, 6 p.m. We'd come together and we'd share what we were learning that week around this thing that we were all dealing with across the nation that was quite frightening and affecting all of the way in which we delivered resources and service and supported folks, and clearly impacted our workforce. Summer of 2020, as we met, we faced this situation that has just been building, and we felt compelled to take it on and look at what could we do that was actionable, not just sit and talk, and what was actionable. And so that was our charge. And within the next few months, we developed 2 areas that we focused on, looking at workforce, and in particular, psychiatric residents and residency. How do we help that become more diverse? How do we focus, and in particular, a plan to focus on Black residents? In particular, Rachel has just talked about the numbers, and for us, it stood out that that was our mission, that was our goal, to move this forward. How could we look at something actionable within our space? It allowed us to think through what would be next. And so we wanted to look at better understanding the problem of recruitment and retention and target curriculum. So those were our 2 areas that the groups worked on for months. And we had, for me in particular, a lot of learning went on there, and we put together a core plan that was going to start with our Black Resident Roundtable. This was a planned event that we spent time understanding what would be the questions that we would be asking of this group. How would we value their time for them to meet? Being able to provide a safe space for them, a safe environment for them to talk freely. The group of residents that we would ask to come forward from our Pennsylvania psychiatric programs who are self-identified as Black and share with us their challenges as well as their areas of support. What was working for them, what was helpful for them in mentoring, and what were the factors that were really making this very difficult process. And some of the data that it shows up a little bit in what Rachel was talking about in that one slide, but there is a fall off when you look at young people who are entering from high school to college to medical school to residency to fellowship to working. There is a significant drop off for those persons that are experiencing this timeline who are Black. And so how could we make a difference and provide safe spaces? So we looked at convening, well, first identifying residents, outreaching to residency programs to ask for residents to self-identify and participate in this roundtable. We offered compensation and valued their time. For most of us, at least for me, I'll only speak for me, if you feed me, I come. So that is our notion, was that they would, you know, at 6 p.m., if we gave them something that they could eat, they would participate. And indeed they did. We planned thoughtfully around how to moderate this. We did not want to put anyone in harm's way. We wanted them to speak openly so we could learn what were their needs, how could we support them over time so that they could stay in their places and perhaps become faculty. How did we support that and understand? So we really wanted to facilitate a discussion around their experiences, what impacted how they decided on a residency program, what were their future professional plans. We wanted to understand what were their experiences around the challenges, microaggressions, feeling welcomed and wanted, and a part of the organization, or feeling isolated in areas. Pennsylvania is a very large state. We have 13 residency programs, and some of those are in very remote areas, and some of those are in highly urban, dense areas. The last thing that I will say around sort of the development is that we were able to identify, and Rachel was one of those. Dr. Sosamulu Shriyanka was another that helped to facilitate the dialogue and the conversation. But there was a lot of thought from this team looking at the questions that we might ask and be able to spur an active conversation. Okay.
Absolutely. And I'll just to add a little bit even to that, and I'll first say I appreciate Marianne even sharing that aspect of, for her, there was learning, and I will say there was learning for me as well. And that part of what we hope to share in this presentation and talk a little bit more concretely about at the end is just lessons learned for us personally, both as, you know, in one case, an ally, in one case, a person of the identity that is being considered and looked at. But just to say a little bit, even in terms of the intent with this effort, I think some of this came back to our identities as community psychiatrists and providers of how do you best think about serving a group of people? Well, go to those people themselves and hear from them. What are your needs? What is your experience? And that our goal, our aim here, and what we hope can be a lesson learned in terms of how we approach this, was trying to be very thoughtful about avoiding minority tax, avoiding being burdensome to the extent that we could, while gathering this key information to make sure that whatever initiative we came up with was directly speaking to the needs conveyed by current residents in the state. So as far as the feedback from this roundtable, and I've kept this very general and broad for anonymity and confidentiality, of course, as far as the folks who participated, I'll first say that personally, as a moderator of this discussion, it was both, it was inspiring to see the bravery of these trainees coming forth and sharing their experiences. It certainly was incredibly painful at moments as a Black faculty member to hear the sorts of experiences that folks were going through in their institutions. But just some of the themes that came through were as an uncertainty amongst these trainees as far as the genuineness of their program's interest or attention to racism, a feeling of, is this just a passing trend or excitement? Is this program really going to show a dedicated commitment to think about things like recruiting a diverse workforce and ensuring that our curriculum has the correct content to train us to meet the needs of diverse populations? worries around minority tax and being asked to fulfill roles or be representatives in certain aspects of the program's operation and sort of initiatives in ways that felt burdensome when these trainees were also just, of course, trying to do their day-to-day legwork of seeing patients and learning how to, be psychiatrists and just the work of being a resident. The importance of communities, both allyship, but also communities and mentorship and sponsorship. I'd say just various forms of support, both support and connection in terms of having a community of like-minded individuals who are going through similar things, a desire to have more access to folks who were further along in the journey to provide that mentorship and sponsorship, and also a desire for more outspoken allyship within their organizations, looking to their colleagues with a hope for more speaking up on some of the issues of microaggressions, of overt discrimination that these trainees had experienced throughout their medical career and path. So I'd say that this table, it was painful. It was in ways not unexpected, given what we see in the data, as Marianne alluded to, in terms of drop off over time, in terms of people pursuing this training path. But I think extremely informative to our efforts in terms of what was going to be, what were the sort of the key issues that we could think to address as an initiative to think about how to increase the workforce by first seeing where the workforce is having areas of dissatisfaction or areas of challenge, that we felt that this is where we'll see that sort of meat in terms of what we should be working on to make sure that folks feel that Pennsylvania is a welcoming and positive place to train and hopefully to stay in terms of providing psychiatric services. So for our next step, we'll talk a little bit about how this content inspired what I would say are sort of our two main initiatives at this point for our Racial Justice Learning Collaborative. And so I'll turn it back over to Marianne in terms of one of our first sort of efforts that we have continued.
Sure, thank you. And so as part of this, I know that we are highlighting the leadership role of the Pennsylvania Psychiatric Leadership Council. What I will also share is that a number of us wore multiple hats, and so there was this connection as well to our Pennsylvania Psychiatric Society. And in particular, I do want to just highlight two amazing allies that were in this process early on, and that was Dr. Larry Reel, and the other is Dr. Richard Silbert. Both of them have left us way too soon, and I just want to pause for a moment because they were really inspirational and provided leadership roles in this process of our group and how we moved forward with understanding and hearing each other and learning from this roundtable, and the themes that they bravely shared with our group, trusting that we might do something positive with it. So we do have these themes that residents are very uncertain about the genuineness of their training programs with the attention to racism. Are they really paying attention to that? And we know that there is institutional racism that gets embedded, and it surprises you when you start to learn more about this. You begin to become more aware of your own biases and those of the institution, that this is just the way we've done it for years and not paying attention. I'll highlight for a moment, if you enter a room and all you see are the images of white men in the room on the wall when you're coming for your interview, that has an effect on, am I welcome in this place as a woman? Am I welcome in this place as a Black person? Am I welcome? And how will I be supported? And so I think that there are many ways in which, that's just one, that actually our program directors shared in their own journey with us over this time. Getting back to the themes, though, for the Black Resident Roundtable. So there is this, can I trust? Is this genuine? Are these people, or are they checking a box? We've talked a lot about, you know, the diversity, equity, and inclusion that all institutions were aspiring for. But is that a checkbox, or is that meaningful change? Is there change in the curriculum? Is there change in how you support faculty in their lack of understanding as to how to deal with microaggressions? And is there a process with which you embrace that lifelong learning and be able to expand that person's abilities as a faculty member so that they do their best work in supporting the residents in the work that they have ahead of them? Rachel mentioned earlier concerns about the minority tax of Black residents and relating to their own well-being in the program. If you're 1 or 2 in a program of 16 or 18, and you're the 2 Black individuals, and the efforts of going to more meetings or being the face of this effort can be very taxing, and it's not necessarily acknowledged. And so there's been, in our group work, a lot of attention to this so that we are valuing a person's time, that time is something that's important and we should be valuing it. There's been a look at systemic racism and discrimination, and in particular, how do we approach that in curriculum? And that has been something that we've also carried forward. The importance of forming these communities with that allyship, and how do we support our residents? So that really has been a way that has moved us toward the importance of the roundtable, not just as a one and done back in the spring of 2021, but a commitment by the group that we would support quarterly meetings of that roundtable virtually. And that has continued. They are fed. That is our effort to support them and value their time, that their time is important. And we continue to listen to what is it that they would like. And we'll get to more of that in the next steps. So we'll, I don't want to.
So speaking even more to a little more to those next steps and thinking about how we wanted to, one of our next steps has been to truly address this what was the expressed concern of the importance of forming communities. As Marianne is saying, we realized that this resident roundtable, it shouldn't just be a one-time event. That we were clearly hearing from the folks who participated, we want to do this again. We were hearing from folks who were perhaps the only person of their identity in their program, that there was real value in having a gathering point without any particular ask or without any particular structure, just a place to be themselves and to connect and fellowship. And so how our organization has thought about practically supporting that is making sure that we have processes in place so that our residencies, folks coming into our residencies in Pennsylvania are aware of this group's existence. We, as the PPLC, provide that logistical support and coordination to keep this group going. As Marianne alluded to, ensure that there's dinner involved, so that there is that sort of aspect of almost, even though folks are gathering across the state, almost sharing a meal together. But I think most importantly, sort of leaving it to the residents who participate to shape the agenda and what the content is of that meeting. We as the PPLC do not join that table. We simply invite the residents to have it as a gathering point. Have a staff person connected to be sure to inform us as far as whether there's anything in particular that we as the PPLC can do for this group. But we really aim for it to be a space for the residents, by the residents, led by the residents, without sort of throwing that logistical work on them of organizing the space, with a hope that it's a place where they can, if it is simply a time to talk and to connect and to gather, and that is what our residents are looking for, that's wonderful. If there are other things that they're seeking from the PPLC, such as mentorship or other forms of support, that we're happy to provide it. And so this has been, I think, one of the key things that we've considered as far as thinking about how do you, in what is, I think in a way, a somewhat simple solution, but how do you really think proactively about the isolation that can come from being a person of a particular identity, being the first of your background to be in a program, experiencing these negative sorts of challenges, things like microaggressions and discrimination, where do you find that connection to have that sense of both shared support, perhaps also shared grieving, depending on what you're experiencing? And so that's what we really see as the function of that roundtable. And so we've so far had it as just that regular quarterly gathering point. Future directions that we're looking at, and this is based on the direct feedback of the trainees who've been involved and what they are looking for as far as what would help them to feel more supported and uplifted as they make their way through their training programs. So we're also looking into, as much as we're Pennsylvania, we're kind of a big, broad state, you know, I think much like Washington State, that we have folks joining virtually this roundtable from all over the state and from quite far, that we hope to create some regional in-person opportunities for these residents to really connect in that different way, and also incorporate mentorship, bring in leaders who are further along in their path to provide that guidance and advice to this group.
And I do want to just underscore what you were just saying, Rachel, that sense of isolation. So if you think about, you know, if you drive from one side of Pennsylvania to the other, similar to Washington, it's a large state, we can be in the hinterlands with a relatively new residency program that's just getting started, and their residents don't have that access to that camaraderie that they might have in Pittsburgh or Philadelphia, in these smaller regional residency programs that are doing wonderful work, but that isolation is really palpable. And being able to have that place to just share experiences and feel heard is very valuable. So we are looking at then, I think, so are we going in the right direction here? Yes.
Oh, yeah.
So I got it. I just got myself upside down. So that sense of trust, will this be something that helps support change in a positive direction? And attention to racism in particular. Is this action intentionable, measurable, translatable? And so how to do that? It's not just getting those opportunities for roundtable discussion and just talk and not see anything change. And so in order to affect that change, the next step that we took was to have a small group that went out to every residency program and met with the program director, at times with the director of the psychiatry department, to get their okay. And we developed the Learning Collaborative that consists of each of the training directors for the psychiatric residency programs in Pennsylvania, and or their designee, or if they'd like, you know, we've had, in addition to just the training director, we might have associate training directors. Sometimes we have chief residents that might participate. But this Learning Collaborative idea, we asked each training director to commit 1 hour a month. It happens to be the third Wednesday at 3 p.m. We've kept that over time. It doesn't always work. So I will tell you, the third week in March is a soap week, that third Wednesday. And so we will probably not be meeting that particular Wednesday. But the training directors have all agreed to participate. And I have been amazed over the course of time, given all of the ebb and flow of the jobs that the training director has to navigate through the year, the amount of participation and energy that occurs in these Learning Collaborative hours. So we are looking at that meeting of that group. They come every month, and what's been amazing is to see their trust amongst each other. Although they might be at ADPERT or other places, this core group has really been open and inviting to hear each other's ideas, to share their feelings of being caught as a middle management person between perhaps the leadership and the residents that they're trying to care for and provide a good education, and how to navigate that and to share their wins and to look at where they still struggle. And so it's really been a wonderful process to see their development as a core group that is wanting to support. How do we become an inviting group of programs within the state of Pennsylvania that supports and offers mentorship and reduces isolation and looks at our own internal structures on a regular basis to be intentionable, measurable, and translatable in our approach to those the racism and the injustices that might get that are embedded and we can change.
Absolutely. And so taking a deeper dive into what is, I see is that, as Marianne has said, this sort of second prong of our effort, it's really sort of challenging our residency training directors to come together. I think particularly because this is a space where, while there certainly isn't a complete absence of evidence in terms of thinking about how do we attract folks of diverse backgrounds, how do we retain people in this field, that there certainly are interventions that one can find in the published literature. Knowing that that literature can be limited, knowing that our directors may not be so, potentially may have not had experience with those sorts of initiatives, and wanting to be sure that we're sharing ideas. We really see this as a way to very practically challenge our directors to really have an opportunity to get down to the micro level of, month by month and in the year, how are you thinking about these issues? You're at your initial orientation. How are you thinking about presenting your program in a way that feels welcoming and supportive to people of marginalized identity? Can we share ideas on that? Are there things that your larger hospital system is doing that you dovetail on? Moving further into the year as you gear up for recruitment, are there particular ways that you're thinking about framing your program and its offerings to give that message to folks who are of a marginalized identity that this is going to be a welcoming and supportive place? When you're thinking about your curriculum content and how you convey to folks the lessons of giving structurally competent, culturally competent care, how do you do that in a creative, interactive way? And so I think we look at it as these training directors being able to sort of utilize their shared expertise as folks who have been in this environment of training and education for quite a few years, but then have a space to sort of to a vulnerable place really to stumble, to come up short, to have a feeling of, I don't quite know how to make this connection of making my program attractive to this particular set of folks, of making sure that I'm bringing in folks who are reflective of the patients that we are serving. Can we learn from each other in terms of this process and find ways to sort of bring in different creative strategies as we develop our curriculum and as we think about recruitment and retention? Part of this effort has really been around putting without adding, of course, too much work with the limited bandwidth, but to really put the onus on our training directors to think together about what are efforts that they can join in and lead with the PPLC there to support them in terms of really being thoughtful about putting Pennsylvania out there as an appealing place to train and to stay, particularly for folks of marginalized identity. And so we've seen, I think, an array of wonderful things come out of this that we'll share a little bit in terms of our lessons learned and our outcomes, in terms of sharing ideas around sort of interactive community-based trips to increase understanding of social determinants of health when we're thinking about the curriculum side of things, thinking about social identity exercises and their role in terms of curriculum and orientation, in terms of making people feel welcome, but also putting identity up front. So a lot of creative ideas that our program directors have shared amongst each other and directly implemented, and really talked about the value they have felt from being able to learn from others in the same position as them about how best to support a diverse workforce. In terms of future directions, our Learning Collaborative's current project is thinking about how to put on a virtual residency fair to sort of expand the reach in terms of putting Pennsylvania on the map as a place that welcomes and is excited about recruiting a diverse workforce, and particularly thinking about the workforce of Black psychiatrists in the state. So thinking about outcomes, and I'll toss it over to Marianne, where I'd say we're in an interesting space with outcomes and lessons learned as far as what you can and can't measure with an effort like this.
Yes. How do we define progress and success? And that has been an ongoing conversation that the team has, and that we have as partnered with that learning collaborative. How do we measure success? In that quantitative mode, thinking about, well, what are the numbers of Black residents that are matched? We have, from the get-go, looked at an annual self-report survey from each program. We also understand that that is not sufficient in what we're talking about, because we're talking about how to develop environment that is safe and supportive, that is reducing racism, is anti-racist, and offers opportunities for residents of color to come and thrive. So it's not just the number, it's also the rest of the environment. And so we are looking at how do we hopefully capture, if this continues its growth and movement, do we see an increase in Black faculty that stays and feels welcome because the environment is changing and allowing them to thrive in their role as an attending psychiatrist and faculty member? Is there, the group has been challenged or challenging each other and thinking about, as you go through that match process each year, how do you offer interviews to folks of color? That has been challenged with, how do we understand the SCOTUS considerations that have been brought to bear for institutions? How do we see changes in what you can offer in terms of sub-internship rotations? Those are sometimes things that require, again, valuing a person in being able to get them there, that not everyone has the ability to pay for their apartment. And so for a 4-week rotation, are there other ways in which you are helping to grow that? Go ahead to the next.
Right. And hopping in, I'll say that it's, I think a challenge here is that, of course, what I think we hope to highlight with this slide is that there are some quantitative metrics that you can think of for an effort like this in terms of how do we measure success? How do we quantify success? Going back to that literature from the beginning in terms of seeing that gap at each stage in terms of representation amongst trainee and faculty. But we well know that sometimes the numbers, that they're going to take some time to move, one, and also that I think there's sometimes our training directors will only have so much control, of course, over how those numbers shift. That if we think about at the end of the day, say a process like the match, that there are a lot of things that go into this. And so we have to think about, we as a group have been really challenged to ponder, how do we measure success, and what are the successes we note that maybe aren't necessarily about numbers, but could be more about some other sort of more intangible benefits that folks are experiencing. I'm gonna move a little fast before I through our next slide or two, because I know we're coming up on time. I'll just briefly say for this slide that these are some future directions that we thought about in terms of quantitative metrics. I've been thinking about things like, should we consider satisfaction surveys, both for the folks who are attending our roundtable and even our training directors as far as their experience of the collaborative. In terms of the work we've done around curriculum development, and what one of the efforts around that the PPLC and this collaborative pulled together is a resource list of curriculum documents. Do we find ways to sort of do some pre-post measurement in terms of how folks are self-report their comfort with serving diverse communities? So a range of metrics that we've considered that we are just at the beginning of thinking about. But what I really like to move to instead is kind of, I'd say, some of the more intangible, not the sorts of things that you might report, say, in a research study or be able to measure as readily, but what we've noted as far as the intangible value of this effort. The fact that we have found that despite the busyness of training directors and the hectic roles that they have, that we have sustained engagement in this learning collaborative and a real active effort to think critically about, beyond gathering, sharing sort of smaller pieces of a little piece of curriculum there or a little presentation there with each other, how can they come together on a group project to start to represent Pennsylvania as a state that is out there and explicit in its interest in recruiting a diverse residency. I think there's that intangible trust amongst training directors in grappling with what can be a really complex, difficult, nuanced issue in terms of thinking about how to support trainees of marginalized identity, what to do when you fall short, and have trainees who've had difficult or adverse experiences in your program when something occurs that might have unintentionally harmed a trainee as far as their sense of themselves and their identity. I think keeping the sustained focus around pipeline, having this collaborative has ensured that we haven't had this sort of flagging as certain issues become perhaps less trendy or less in the public dialogue, that this has really kept that sort of commitment within our group to think about, we want to be building this pipeline. We want to be considering how we can be sure that we are building the workforce that we want to see. I think even though we have not collected that feedback from our roundtable participants, the fact that it is still ongoing and sustained and active is something that we see as a positive outcome. The fact that we are seeing folks sort of voting with their virtual feet, if you will, and demonstrating to us that this has value and that this is something useful. And I think that other sort of just the value of the content that was our springboard for creating the 2 initiatives that we have so far, we also see as a really important outcome, that we're able to get this important information from our trainees on the ground that then is able to sort of inform and stay as our lens in terms of how do we think next in terms of recruiting a diverse workforce. Again, being mindful of time, I'm going to move to sort of our just quick closing reflections, that in terms of sharing what it's been like as a person of a racial minority identity and as an ally, if you will, in Marianne's case, doing this work. I'll just comment for myself that I think it is both invigorating and at times tiring and dispiriting, that a key lesson for me has been to both know when to dive in and know when to take some space from the work, but that it has been primarily energizing, just in particular to see a sustained commitment across amongst the majority of our training leadership in Pennsylvania, really taking this on seriously and wanting to be a part of a change, even if folks may have a feeling that they may not exactly know how to make that change, but having the bravery to want to learn together in terms of how to build a diverse workforce and improve their curriculum in this area of anti-racism. I'll pass it over to Marianne for any sort of closing reflections.
Sure. Thanks, Rachel. And I just will say, as I've learned to be a better ally, there's been a wonderful, enriching understanding around history and around creating safe space and valuing the idea that we need to support with mentorship and reduce isolation and support that pipeline, and that we all have opportunities to be a partner in that process and learn from each other. So it's just been quite an enriching process for me, and I have gained so much myself, and I hope that we are able to sustain that.
Right, so that is all we have for you. And so I know we just have a minute left. And so I would say if there's any quick comments of that, I'd say we particularly welcome any future outreach in terms of if there's an interest in doing work like this at the University of Washington, that really eager to spread the word, as far as even if you feel you are not an expert in recruiting a diverse workforce, we as an organization did not necessarily feel we were either, but we dove in and this is where we are.
Well, Dr. Talley, Dr. Albath, thank you for this presentation today. And I think some of the questions that were coming to my mind, I think were addressed in the last sort of several minutes. It is interesting to think about maintaining momentum and keeping things moving ahead. I think my understanding about collaboratives at times, that's one of the potential risks, is sort of decreased interest over time, and you focusing in on that and maintaining motivation and interest, and seeing that at different stages too, in trainees and training directors. It's very interesting, and even with that, continuing to take on what's the next step. And I think, Dr. Talley, you mentioned it as something substantial beyond talking, and I think you seem to be focusing in on moving forward again. I guess one question here, no one posed a question. I do wonder, for example, if Washington was looking to replicate this, You mentioned that residents sometimes ask for things that maybe you hadn't intended for, or ask for support that wasn't part of the original plan. What are some common things that come up that someone's starting something similar might be prepared for?
Right. I think it's an
Well,
interesting. Oh, go ahead.
it's an interesting question, and I guess I think about what I have learned in this process so far is that it's important to understand what are the needs. So being able to have a place where you can gather that information about what will be helpful or what is working and how to support that. Having that grounding has really helped us in our structure and moving forward.
And if I could quickly sort of piggyback on that, and I know we're a minute over time, I think it's so critical for any effort like this to first hear from your stakeholders directly. That, we have in some literature on the sorts of things that minority trainees experience, things like microaggressions and sort of differences in terms of their evaluations, things along those lines. But I think it's so key to hear directly from your constituency, if you will, before deciding what your next steps will be. And so our reasoning for doing the roundtable and the collaborative as our particular next steps was based on the specific feedback from our trainees. As we're thinking about replicating this effort, and I should have mentioned that we started with Black identifying trainees as our first step with a hope to then replicate this for other folks of other marginalized identity. Our next step has not been, well, we'll create another collaborative roundtable. So we'll talk to that next group of trainees. We're thinking particularly the Latinx and Hispanic folks in our training programs to hear, in their view, what are the things that they would find most valuable to help them feel supported and feel that programs are interested in what would do them best in terms of training. So I think starting with that constituency and their sharing of their experiences is a key guidepost for what to do in this sort of work.
It's interesting. So you have a goal, you set the vision, and then here, the methods, so to speak, are informed by what you're learning. Yeah, interesting. Okay. Well, look, here we are just at 1 o'clock, or a couple minutes after. I think it would be interesting to continue talking, posing questions. We've unfortunately have to end due to time. But again, thank you very much for presenting on this collaboratively. I think it went well with two people presenting, commenting on on sort of following up on statements and so on. And I want to thank you for joining today, for presenting in the Grand Round series. And we could end it there. So
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having us.
okay. Thank you. Bye.